Hi, everyone. This is Dustin Hausner. I'm the Jewish Outreach and Program Director at the Wayne YMCA. All our Jewish programs is funded through the Jewish Federation of Northern New Jersey. So today we have a very interesting guest who actually runs a very fascinating center. We have with us Roger Berkowitz, who is the founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities. He's also a professor of political studies, philosophy, and human rights at Bard College. Professor Berkowitz, it's wonderful to have you here today.
It's great to be here, Dustin. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. So before we dive into the center and obviously, her great works, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about yourself and what was the decision to have a center.
Well, Hannah Arendt, is one of the more fascinating figures in 20th century intellectual life, let alone Jewish intellectual life. She was born in Germany in 1906 and studied with two of the great philosophers in Germany, Martin Heidegger and Karl Jaspers. Was eventually arrested in 1933, escaped, and made it to France, where she worked with Youth Aliyah and other groups. She eventually then was put in a concentration camp in Gurs, and then escaped that and made her way eventually through Marseille to Portugal, where she sailed to the United States. She taught in many different places, and her husband, Heinrich Blücher, who she met in France, taught for 16 years at Bard College. So this is how I got to Hannah Arendt. I had always read Hannah Arendt as an undergrad and a graduate student, and loved her work and found it to be deeply meaningful. But when I was hired to teach at Bard in 2005, the first thing I did when I stepped onto the Bard's campus was visit her grave. She, as well as Heinrich Blücher, are buried at Bard. And I then learned that she had left her private library to the college, and the library was housed in part of the Bard library. So, I came to Bard in 2005, and her birthday, she was born in 1906, so 2006 was the 100th anniversary of her birth. And I was not a Hannah Arendt scholar by any means, but I someone who deeply appreciated her work and the importance of her work. And what I should say is, what I loved about her work was, while that she was deeply educated in philosophy and literature and history, she wrote about the world, right? She never really wrote a book just on philosophy, maybe with the exception of the last unfinished work, The Life of the Mind, that she died before it was finished. She really wrote about problems, whether it was totalitarianism and the Holocaust, or the loss of authority in the world, or education. She was interested in how do we make sense of our world today, and think it through the humanities. And that part of her work is what I always loved. And so I went to the president of the college and I said, let's have a conference celebrating her birthday. But and he said, great, what do you have in mind? And I said, well, I don't want an academic conference. She wasn't an academic. I mean, okay, she taught in colleges, but she never accepted a tenure track job. She had options. She just never wanted it. She didn't want to be stuck in the academic world, and she wanted to write about the world. And so I said, let's do something a little different. Let's invite, non-specialists, and let's invite philosophers, but let's also invite activists, and let's invite business people, and let's invite writers and artists, and let's have them come and talk about, why Hannah Arendt matters today, what's meaningful about her work. And so we did, and the conference went very well. It was in 2006, and a book got published out of it called Thinking in Dark Times. And her literary executor spoke at the conference, Jerome Cohn, and he said to me afterwards, you know, this is the kind of conference Hannah Arendt would have loved. Could we start a Hannah Arendt Center at Bard? I said to him, I'm not a Hannah Arendt scholar. I really like her work, but that's not what I do. But if you're open to it, we'll create a center that's alive to her memory and alive to um, her example of a thinker who thinks without ideology, without a political affiliation, approaches problems always in spontaneous and new ways,
Mhm.
and thinks about the world. And he said that's exactly what we want. And so we started the center in 2000. I mean, you know, people always say, when did the center start? Well, the first conference was 2006. We then had to figure some things out. So, you know, we usually date it to then. And that's how it began.
Very nice. So I'm curious, what type of programming do you, I mean, obviously we have the coronavirus, so I'm sure it's not going exactly as it would normally, but can you tell me some of the programming or things that you do at the center?
Yeah, I mean, so the center really does work on a number of levels. We're situated at a liberal arts college, Bard College, where Hannah Arendt's husband taught for 16 years and was a very influential professor, and where she's buried. And so, you know, at the college, we run events, talks. We have a number of lecture series. We have a lecture series called The Courage to Be,
Hmm.
um, which actually was developed out in conversation with the religious chaplaincies at Bard. And the premise of it was, um, in a world increasingly bureaucratic, in a world increasingly in which people have to do things for their jobs that may or may not be ethical or right, um, how do you prevent the doing of evil?
Mm.
Right? This was a key question of Hannah Arendt's. She wrote a book which some of you may have heard of, Eichmann in Jerusalem,
Mm.
where when Adolf Eichmann was arrested by the Israelis in 1961, she wrote to the, I want to cover this trial. Uh, I want to see the evil of the Nazis face to face. Right? That's basically how she put it.
Mm.
And she went to the trial and she saw Eichmann face to face. And she wrote a book saying he was evil,
Mhm.
but his evil was not the kind of evil we usually associate with madmen and crazies.
Mm.
His evil was in his banality, in his um, inability to see the world from others' perspectives, in the ability to think that he was, you know, she was just shocked by his ability to think that Jews would understand that he did it out of a desire to do well and do his job well, and and take it seriously, and not, you know, out of any animosity towards Jews. And she saw this as um, an incredible lack of an inability to see the world from the perspective of others, to think, as she put it.
Mm.
And she said that it's this inability to think, to see the world from outside of your own narrow perspective, which she said may be the cause of evil in the modern world.
Mm.
And and she asked the question, why did some people resist evil and others didn't? Right? I mean, many of her closest friends in Germany joined the Nazi Party. Not only Heidegger, but he was one.
Mm.
And she was obsessed with this question. She, and not only Heidegger, but, and she says that most intellectuals joined the party. Why? Um, and she asked this question: why did they rationalize what they were doing? Why did they say, well,
Mm.
I'm going to join and work from the inside, and it's the lesser evil? And she thought, well, to say it's the lesser evil is to forget that it's evil.
Mm.
Um, and so she was really interested in that. And one of the answers that she gives is that in order to really push back and prevent oneself from being taken in by this kind of bureaucratized, rationalized doing of evil, you need to believe in something deep. You need to have a strong character. You need a sense of what I am and what I won't do. And one of the grounds for that, she says, is the breakdown of religion. You could not imagine something like this happening, she thinks, in a religious world. And so the Courage to Be program creates a series of classes and lectures. So the classes are individual classes taught by different faculty all around the question of moral and political courage, where we share texts, and then there's a lecture series that all the students in all the different classes have to go to, and it creates a sort of a conversational module on campus around the question of what evil is and what it means to be courageous in the modern world. We have another lecture series called Tough Talks, student run. Again, these are all student run, where we bring in speakers whose views are outside of the mainstream on a college campus. That could be conservative, but it could also be very liberal. We've had wildly interesting speakers that the students have picked along this series, and it's one of our more popular ones. We host a program called the American Jewish Peace Archives, which has, for the last 7 or 8 years, been an oral history program about peace activists in Israel and the US and in other Jewish areas. There's a new project which Eliza Becker, who runs that, has started called the Meanings Project, which is based on interviews and oral history around the shootings in Squirrel Hill Synagogue in the Tree of Life Synagogue in Squirrel Hill in Pittsburgh. So we do a number of programs like this. We also have a virtual reading group. So every Friday, people from all over the world, it's now over about 100 people every Friday, meet at 1 o'clock Eastern time and read together part of a book of Hannah Arendt's and talk about it. That's for about 90 minutes. And that's, so I said that we have a lot of things that are based at Bard. We then have a lot of things on the internet. The virtual reading group is one. We have a weekly newsletter called Amor Mundi. Amor Mundi means for the love of the world. It was a favorite phrase of Hannah Arendt. She says that the world is, she lived through the Holocaust. She lived through a lot of awful stuff. She lived through McCarthyism. And what she says is what she needed to learn was to love the world and to be grateful for the world, to be able to reconcile to the world. And that was, in many ways, what much of her writing was about. And so we have a newsletter that goes out twice a week, but with similar content. It's free and it goes out to about 12,000 people a week. And it's called Amor Mundi. And that's something we do on the internet. And then the third sort of box that we fill is that we run fairly large international events, conferences. The big one we have every year is usually in October at Bard, and it's on a timely theme. Last year was racism and anti-Semitism. So we had the premise of that conference was that anti-Semitism, as Arendt understands it, is a kind of ideological racism. And so she spent a lot of her time writing about anti-Semitism. I mean, 500-600 pages of her work are about anti-Semitism. And she reads it as different from Jew hatred. And that's sort of one of the interesting things. It's not about simply not liking Jews. She says, look, people have not liked Jews for a long time. That's not new. But anti-Semitism as an ideology that imagined the need to exterminate Jews, that, she says, is a 20th century or 19th century phenomenon. It began in the late 19th century. And she tries to understand it. And so she thinks a lot about racism. And so this was a conference that brought people who write about racism and brought out people who write about anti-Semitism together to try and have of that conversation. So we have, at most of our conferences, we have about 20 speakers. We usually have over 2 days, about 700 or 800 different audience members. People come from all over the country. People actually come from Europe and Asia for these conferences just to be there. And it's a 2-day mix of interviews, talks, panels, breakout sessions, discussions about a topic. Our conference that was supposed to be this coming October was on revitalizing democracy, but with a particular idea around something called citizen assemblies, which not so many people have heard of these days, at least in the United States. But the premise is that back in Greek times, and even in Italian democracies, the representatives who ran a democratic governments were not elected. They were chosen by lottery, like we choose our jury system. And the first democracy that elected its representatives instead of choosing them by lottery was actually the United States. And a lot of people around the world, a lot of scholars and activists have started to think that it's actually important that choosing democratic representatives through election basically excludes too many people. It excludes people who don't have the money or the time or the education to get elected. And it actually makes the democracy too elitist. And that was the argument that Aristotle made when he said that democracies have to choose their representatives by lottery. It's also the argument Montesquieu made when he said democracies have to choose their representatives by lottery. And Rousseau made it as well. Now, they weren't all in favor of democracy. Some of them said that's the problem with democracy, is it chooses its representatives by lottery, and therefore they're not smart enough or educated enough or elite enough. But there are a lot of new ideas about how to bring citizen assemblies into politics. Just in the last 6 months, in both England and in France, they have had national citizen assemblies to talk about climate change, where citizens have come together over a series of months for a couple days at a time to meet, deliberate, talk to experts, and they're making proposals to the British and French government about how to deal with climate change. These are being used in country level, and state levels, and local town levels. And so we're going to be having really the first major US conference on the potential to use these citizen assemblies in politics at the Arendt Center. It was supposed to be in October, so we're going to have 1 day of events online in the Zoom webinars on October 16th.
Okay.
And then the full conference has now been postponed to April 15th and 16th, 2021. And we'll be having the conference then. So those are, I mean, we do a lot more, but those are some sense of the kind of things we do here at the Hannah Arendt Center.
No, I mean, first of all, that sounds like quite a lot, to say the very least, and I think it's wonderful that so much of it is student run in the programming. So I think that's amazing. You hit on a number of different things, so I'm going to try my best to navigate a little bit. But one of the things you mentioned was obviously she was a prolific writer. She had a very fascinating history when it comes to her Jewish identity. To my understanding, again, you know much better than I do, she didn't grow up necessarily in a deeply religious Jewish household. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit just about her reconciling her Jewish identity, because it's an unusual evolution over time, especially with her being in the Holocaust, her coverage of Eichmann, and so forth. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, she grew up in Germany, born in 1906. Her father was from a family of rabbis, but her father and her mother both were social democrats. They were, or democratic socialists, depending on how you want to call it. Her father died very early when she was, I think, 6, quite young. And she was largely raised by her mom and later a stepfather. But she was always very aware, as she says, that she was Jewish. But that was not the family's main identity.
Right.
That said, as she grew up, she encountered anti-Semitism in Germany, and she describes exactly how her mother taught her to react to it. If a friend or a schoolmate would say something, she was supposed to stand up for herself and resist. If a teacher said it, she was supposed to stand up, walk out of the classroom, come home, tell her mother. Her mother would write a letter, and she would go back to school the next day. And so she had, it was definitely, her mother took it seriously, but it was not a central defining factor, I think, of her early life. Obviously, by the time of the 1930s, things changed. She became a Zionist in that period, largely because she said the Zionists were the only ones taking Hitler seriously and fighting back. She actually was attended one of the World Zionist Congresses as a representative. As I said, she worked for the Zionist organization led by Kurt Blumenfeld. She was arrested, eventually escaped. Not escaped. She was let go. She says in an interview by the fact that she befriended the young police officer who had just been promoted from the criminal to the political police, and he didn't know what to make of her, so he let her go. And she made it to France. She worked for Youth Aliyah. She soured on Zionism pretty quickly for a whole host of reasons. The main one is that she came to see nation states as something of a anachronism. So in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, one of the key arguments that she makes about the origins of totalitarianism is what she calls the failure of the nation state. And the way she understands that is that the nation state is a Jekyll and Hyde monstrosity because it's a nation and a state. So think of any nation state that was in Germany, in Europe at the time. Just take Germany as one example. You had Germans, and then you had German nationals. So was a Jew a German? And she says, I never felt a German. I never in my life felt that I was a German, right? And yet, in every nation state, whether it was Czechoslovakia or Hungary or Poland, there were the nationals, and then there were everyone else, and there were all these minorities. And after World War I, you had lots of states with large minority populations, and these things were created called the minority treaties, which aren't really talked about so much today, which were supposed to give all these minorities certain rights, language rights, economic rights, whatever it was. And what she says is this was a disaster because it's created second-class citizens within each of these states, and that the nation states didn't want the minorities didn't really want the nation states, but they couldn't figure anything out. And that in the end, the nation states really only had three options with the minorities. They could assimilate them,
right?
They could expel them, or they could kill them. And she said that in a world in which we believe in equality, the state stands for equality, because within a state, all citizens are supposed to be equal. But the nation stands for inequality in the sense that we're Germany, the Germans are above the Franks and the Jews. And so she became very much convinced that the nation state was not compatible with equality. And she saw Zionism insofar as it demanded that Israel be a Jewish state, a state that was destined to lead to creating second-class citizens who were non-Jews, and that she didn't think it would work. And so she has a very famous essay called Zionism Reconsidered, which she published in the 60s, which is sort of her break with Zionism, along these and other lines. She famously said in a speech, an acceptance speech of a prize she accepted, that her basic philosophy is always to say she's Jewish, and that if she's attacked as a Jew, she defends herself as a Jew. She's never going to try and assimilate. And one of the sort of sub themes of a lot of her writings is an attack on assimilation. She's very negative about what assimilation does to Jewish consciousness, and she thinks it's unhealthy. She also said, another famous line of hers is, when she wrote Eichmann in Jerusalem, one of her closest friends was Gershom Scholem, the famous Jewish scholar and mystic scholar. And he wrote her a number of letters about this, and they had a very angry exchange. And he said at one point, you're not acting like a friend of the Jews, right? And she's like, I have no love for any people. I love my friends. I don't love Americans as Americans. I don't love Germans as Germans. I don't love Jews as Jews. And so that was a famous, another famous exchange of hers. So yes, she was engaged in questions of the Jewish question her whole life. She pretty much largely retreated from that after 1963, because after Eichmann in Jerusalem was published, the book, I mean, as I'm sure some of you know, the reaction amongst the American Jewish community and also the Israeli Jewish community was, for the most part, intensely negative. I mean, so obviously there were exceptions. So some Jewish figures loved the book and praised it, but the institutional Jewish world really disowned her, and she retreated from that world after that.
So let me ask you, because you talked about them briefly a little bit. So obviously, as you said just now, the book came out. There was a lot of negative backlash. You earlier explained really the idea of the banality of evil, which I think is a very famous term that's associated with her. I guess my question in that regard is, was it felt that through the book it wasn't, because when you elaborated just a few moments ago, I thought you did a very good job in explaining the question of, her curiosity of why that evil is not simply the caricature in a Saturday morning cartoon, that there's, why people who are not necessarily pro-good or pro-evil, like why they do evil acts. So I'm curious if there was a feeling that the definition was lost in what she was trying to explain, or that it was just too soon to something like the Holocaust where people would have such a conversation. And in your personal analysis.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a hard question to answer, how a book gets stamped in a certain way.
Sure.
She was convinced that the vast majority of people who preached against the book in sermons and in print hadn't read it. I think that's probably true for many of them. I think it's hard to read the book as a whole and come away with a sense that this woman was an anti-Semite or a Jew hater or defending Adolf Eichmann. I mean, I think that's the farthest thing from the book. I mean, it just doesn't seem to me at all to correspond with the reading of the book. And the last pages of the book are her justification for why he should be killed. I think why people attacked it is a hard question. one answer is, okay, she argued this thesis about the banality of evil, which, by the way, appears once in the book, on the last line of the book. It's not a theme of the whole book, although the publisher decided to give the book the subtitle, The Banality of Evil. So, it's there. And I think some people were just not ready to hear the nuance of her argument about the banality of evil, and they took it to mean, oh, she's saying Eichmann's not evil, which is the farthest thing from what she was saying at all. But that's how I think it was read. She also said in the book that so one of the things that happened at the trial is that the Israeli government brought a number of witnesses, hundreds, to speak about the Holocaust.
Right.
She said this had nothing to do with Adolf Eichmann. I mean, some of them, most of them never mentioned him, and she said in a trial, you're actually supposed to bring in people who have relevant evidence to the person on trial. And she was critical of the trial as a whole, as a show trial about the Holocaust and not about Adolf Eichmann. And so some people were upset that she criticized what was, for many Jews, really the first time that the Holocaust was spoken about publicly after the war.
Right.
And so I think for a lot of Jews, this was a very cathartic and meaningful emotional experience, the trial of Adolf Eichmann. And she was like, this was all not part of the meaningful part of a trial. A trial is about justice. You have a defendant. These people aren't even talking about him. Why are we there? Then she talked about, some of the people at the trial talked about the ways in which Eichmann worked to so Eichmann worked in stages. The first stage of his life was simply research about the Jewish question and trying to get Jews to emigrate while taking their money and other things. The second part was concentrating them, and the third part was exterminating them.
Right.
And in a number of those years, especially before the extermination camps, Eichmann worked closely with Jewish leaders. And some of those Jewish leaders testified at the conference. And so there became a question around collusion and cooperation, and to what extent Jews cooperated and colluded with Eichmann in order to save some Jews at the expense of others. And so Arendt addressed this. And, it's only 3 or 4 pages in the text, but, in a 200-page book, but it's there. And she said, as a Jew, right? That's what she says. As a Jew, this aspect of what happened, the Jewish collusion, was the worst part of the whole thing. And now some people took that to mean that the Jews were responsible for the Holocaust. Again, that is not what she said. But she did say that if the Jews hadn't colluded, the Nazis would have had to spend a lot more time and power and money, and fewer Jews would have died. And she gives some evidence for this. And there's some studies that actually back this up that were published at the time. So she makes these arguments. People weren't thrilled. Whether, it's not that she was the first one to say these things. Other people had said them.
Right.
So it wasn't that she was the first. It's that she said them in a fairly straightforward way, which is the way she writes, with a fair bit of humor or irony. And in a book about the trial of Eichmann, which people thought, then there's the fact that 99% of the people who had written about this were men. This is a first book by a woman, right? Writing about this. I don't think you can discount that. And then you had this pile-on effect where people just jumped on her. I think, again, most of whom never read the book, but were told that it was anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish, that it excused Eichmann, that it blamed the Jews, none of which is true as far as any fair reading of the book that I've been able to come across. But it did lead to a major controversy. She responded to it in the way she does such things. She answered a few of the more serious responses in writing and then stayed silent. And as I said, retreated from Jewish issues for the rest of her life. Only 10 more years, but.
Let me ask you another question about kind of the Jewish right. I know that's kind of been the focus, but obviously she's had a very large work of different writings, and you know, some of the books you had mentioned, The Origins of Totalitarianism, which is a very fascinating book. You know, others such as The Human Condition, On Revolution. I'm curious because you had talked about a little bit the origins of totalitarianism, and I believe, and I know you have, which we'll talk later about ways to learn more and contact you. I know you have a YouTube channel where you talked about her view and the importance of understanding the difference between Jew hatred and anti-Semitism, and the challenge of what that means as Jews in accepting the two terminologies. And I'm just kind of curious in regards to that. Why do you think such a discussion could potentially be very relevant today? Because as we know, there's certainly many incidents that are deemed anti-Semitic. There's ones that are, you know, people want to take back and say, you know, Jewish hatred. But I think she really challenges the question in a very fascinating way. And I would just love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. Thanks. Thanks, Dustin. Yeah, I mean, so one of the things I said very early on, and I think it's so important, is what I love about Arendt is that she comes at things from directions nobody expects.
Yeah.
I mean, she is truly one of the most original thinkers of the 20th century. And what I love about her is whenever she's going to write about something, you don't know what she's going to say. Once she says it, it sort of fits in and you can make sense of it. But she is really unique. And the way she saw anti-Semitism, I think, is exemplary of that. You know, she, in writing The Origins of Totalitarianism, she read dozens of books and articles and essays and stuff by Nazis. She also lived through it. Right. And her job, you know, for the Zionist organization, the one she got arrested for, was reading Nazi propaganda and photocopying it and trying to smuggle it out of Germany so that the West could see what was actually being said in Germany. So she was actually quite well versed, unfortunately, in Nazi ideology and Nazi propaganda. And what she came to understand is that much of Nazi anti-Semitic propaganda actually had very little to do with Jews. You know, it was the Jews are the cause of this, the Jews are the cause of that, but it wasn't actually about Jews. And many of the people who wrote it had very little impact of Jews or little experience of Jews. A lot of people wrote it, you know, in from towns or areas of Germany or other parts of Europe where Jews basically weren't. And what she says is that, you know, on the other hand, Jew hatred, you know, which has religious and other grounds, is a prejudice, right? It's a deep prejudice. And Jew hatred can lead to someone saying, I don't want Jews in my country club, or I don't want Jews in my, you know, in my store. But it doesn't necessarily in any way mean I want Jews exterminated or I want Jews out of the country. It can, but it doesn't have to. And so she asks the question, what changed, right? What shifted such that Jew hatred could become an ideology? And it's a sort of a longer story, but it has to do with the rise of science and the attempts to create pseudoscientific explanations for the problems of the world. And so she argues that ideologies are ideas, science are claims where you claim that there's one key to the history. And if you got rid of Jews, everything would be okay. Or you got rid of, you know, blacks, or you killed all the blacks, everything would be okay. And so she begins to develop this idea that that ideologies, while they can, you know, be related to biases and prejudices and hatred, are quite different. So how does it matter today? Well, I mean, this is, you know, our conference was on racism and anti-Semitism. You know, there's a lot of talk today about anti-racism, right? This idea that we all want to be anti-racists or anti-Semites, if you want to extend the metaphor. And I think Arendt allows us to think about this in somewhat original and maybe interesting ways, which is to say, prejudice is not something we can get rid of. She thinks. She says, look, to be human is to be prejudiced. Everyone has prejudices, you know. And if by racism we mean prejudice, anti-racism, which means anti-prejudice, is a kind of inhuman demand. We're always gonna have prejudice. And the problem is not prejudice per se. It's when the prejudice becomes a political demand for, well, extermination or slavery or discrimination, and that we have to make these kind of distinctions. And so if anti-Semitism is a racist ideology, the problem of anti-Semitism is the racist ideological part. It's not necessarily the prejudice. Now, people say, oh, well, prejudice is bad. And her answer is, it can be, but there are also maybe good prejudices, right? It's a good prejudice to not like Nazis. But what her view is, whether they're good or bad, prejudices are part of what it means to be human. Our job is to constantly challenge and probe prejudices and make people aware of their prejudices, but not to rid us of prejudices. And so I think if we understand that distinction she's making, I think we get a lot closer to understanding what a real anti-racism would be, which is not saying that we're interested in patrolling everyone's thoughts and whether they're prejudiced or not. I mean, so much of what's going on right now is trying to see if somebody is really prejudiced, or, you know, I mean, we're firing people who maybe said a joke or said something here or there. And from her point of view, you know, that's, I think, misdirected. And so that's one way this focus on racism and anti-Semitism as ideologies is important.
So just for as a quick clarification, because again, I think you explained it, you know, the difference between anti-Semitism as an ideological concept of Jewish hatred versus Jewish hatred because Jews are Jews, basically, of their religion, their beliefs, things like that. When you said earlier just about, you know, the Nazis didn't hate Jews, you're talking about, you know, the ideological concept they helped construct. I just want a clarification on that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, think of it this way. So Eric Ward, you know, who spoke at our conference, you know, talks about how racism, anti-Black racism in the United States is almost inconceivable without anti-Semitism. And you think, what does that mean? Well, you know, he spent a lot of time delving into white supremacist and neo-Nazi organizations. And what he found is that a lot of what these people say is, well, they're racist, right? Blacks couldn't have achieved civil rights on their own, right? How did they do it? The Jews. And if you actually look at the white supremacist websites and the white supremacist, missions, more of it's about Jews than it is about blacks. Anti-Semitism has become an ideological structure of white supremacy that is actually not often about Jews. It's an explanation of how blacks started to acquire certain powers and rights in the United States. And so that's one way in which anti-Semitism becomes such an ideological construct that's actually divorced from Jews. And he said that actually, as a black man, he could go in posing as an anti-Semite and be more accepted by some of these white supremacist organizations in a way that as a Jew he never could.
Interesting. No, it's very thought-provoking, a lot of what you're saying, which of course was a staple of hers, of, she wasn't conservative, she wasn't liberal, she, all sorts of things, to say the very least, which we could have an entire conversation about that in itself. But in regards to a modern audience, or just anyone who maybe have never heard of her and her, long history of works, as you said, it's not just about Judaism, it's about a wide range of issues. What would you want someone's takeaway to be in either reading one of her books or to kind of find out more about her, or find out about the center more? What would you want to take away for whomever is watching this right now?
Well, for me, what Hannah Arendt is a thinker, right? She says, I'm not a philosopher. She called herself a political philosopher, but she was a thinker. She was someone who sought, whatever the issue was, to look to literature, philosophy, history, and try and think it freely. And that's what I love about her work, is she provokes, she provokes thought. And that's what we try and do with her. So I would say, first of all, read her. Especially, if you're someone who has had a negative impression of her because of Eichmann in Jerusalem, which I do realize many Jews, especially who grew up my parents' generation in the United States, do. Go and read Eichmann in Jerusalem. If you want some help with it, the virtual reading group read Eichmann in Jerusalem, and our sessions are on YouTube. You can watch them and you can read along with us, although we already did it. But if you want to just read some Hannah Arendt herself, join the virtual reading group. It's a great community. We have a really wonderful group of people who come back every week. Many of them have now gotten to know each other. They have reunions. They fly around the world to talk to each other. It's a wonderful thing. They come to our conferences, and then come to our conferences. Those are great things. But above all, read Hannah Arendt. She, most of her text. Okay, she wrote a number of books.
Yep.
But she wrote probably 150 essays. Huge number of essays and shorter works, and they were mostly published in the New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, Menorah, Commentary, Dissent, all sorts of things. They're written for a educated audience in the 1950s and 60s, which is more demanding than an educated audience today. Unfortunately, I think people today find it a little harder, but they're written for non-experts. They're written for an educated lay audience, and I think it's eminently understandable. So a good introduction to Hannah Arendt may be a collection of her essays. I highly recommend a couple of collections. One is Responsibility and Judgment. Another is Essays in Understanding, which currently the virtual reading group just started reading 2 weeks ago. So if people are interested in it, they could join. We're going to be reading it for the next 3 months. They could join the virtual reading group and read Essays in Understanding with us. This particular book, Between Past and Future, is one of my favorite. It's a little demanding, but it's a great book. Crises of the Republic great essays about a Republican crisis. It's America in the 1960s.
Mm.
Every essay in that book deeply relevant to what's going on today.
Mm.
One essay is called Lying in Politics. Can't be more relevant than that. Civil Disobedience, On Violence, and then Thoughts on Politics and Revolution. So those are the 4 essays in Crises of the Republic. Highly recommend that book. All of these books we've read in our virtual reading group. We'll read them again at some point. But the point is, our lectures and discussions about them are online on YouTube, and you can use that as a way to help you find a way through these texts.
So the best ways are, besides your YouTube channel that was just mentioned, is also your website. Any other resources where people want to learn more or to look up more information?
Well, I mean, I think our website is a pretty good entree. It's Hannah Arendt Center at Bard. It's hac.bard.edu. There's a, you know, her unpublished papers are online at the Library of Congress website. That's a little bit more of a techno, you know, I mean, it's a little bit more for experts, but it's a good way to poke around. But she's definitely going through a moment right now of incredible relevance in our culture. And so, you know, there's almost not a day that goes by where she's not talked about in one of the major publications in the country. So just be on the lookout for her. You Google her. But I mean, honestly, it's one thing to read what people say about her, because honestly, there's people use her for a lot of things, and I'm a little hesitant to sometimes endorse all of them, but I try and be good about it. But I'd say read Hannah Arendt. She's not hard. She's not that hard, and she's exciting. And I really do recommend people try and pick up 1 or 2 of her books and make their way through them.
Excellent. Well, Professor Berkowitz, I want to thank you so much for making the time to speak with us today and to let us know a little bit of insight on obviously who she was, and obviously about the amazing programming your center does. For anyone who's interested, as was mentioned, check out the website, check out the YouTube channel. I hope everyone will stay safe, stay healthy. Professor Berkowitz, thank you again for joining us today.
Dustin, thanks very much. You stay safe. Talk to you soon.
Absolutely.